Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to be able to speak today on the appropriation bill. This is the budget, this is the bill that the government seeks approval to withdraw the money that will pay for our public service, for our schools, for our hospitals, for our police, for everything that the government does over the coming year. It provides an enormous level of detail around some of those initiatives. It provides very scant detail in others, but such is the way of things. We have the budget papers to consider. The opposition will, of course, support the appropriation bill. It would be madness for any opposition ever not to. It is necessary to enable services to continue for the people of South Australia. We take this opportunity to reflect on some of the matters contained within the budget, some of the information contained in the budget, and what it says about the government's stewardship of our tax dollars, of indeed the public money and the public's trust in the government as to how they are spending that money. Today I'm going to make some general reflections. I'm going to talk specifically about some of the things that people in my electorate of Morialta would have been very eager to see in this budget but were disappointed to miss out on. And then I'm going to spend the bulk of my time reflecting on one particular area within my portfolio, that of the government's response to the Royal Commission into Early Childhood Education and Care. For the Deputy Speaker's benefit, there are budget lines specifically relevant to that response that I can provide the Deputy Speaker with if needed. This is a budget, the Labor Party's second budget since coming to government, that I think belies the unrealistic optimism that the first budget contained, and I think its major measures are in many ways optimistic, to say the least, certainly present spin and lack of substance to the South Australian people. Last year, the Labor Party came to government and immediately presented a budget where they said this year we were going to have a surplus of more than $200 million. They applied an efficiency dividend to every government department with the exception of some frontline agencies, and they said that all of those agencies would deliver on those efficiencies, and that was how Labor was going to pay for its significant spending promises, its election promises, some of them worthy, some of them pet political projects built around electoral cycles and marginal seats. The fact that almost every single department in government failed to meet its budget in the last 12 months is a sign of reckless mismanagement. It's a sign of negligence. It's a sign that there is no discipline in this government at all, because, of course, when you have almost every department, except for the Electoral Commissioner, who saved $1 million, and except for TAFE SA, who, of course, have benefited in the last couple of budgets from a resetting of their expected revenue, and indeed the cuts that have been imposed on them by Tom Coutts-Antonis, the member for West Torrens, when he was the Treasurer in 2017. Except for those two departments, every other department blew its budget. Now, the challenge for a government when it has $1.3 billion worth of overspend within its departments is to say, well, are we going to do better next year? Are we somehow going to reimpose some discipline on our departments? Is there some central guidance that can be given to agencies to assist them in meeting their savings target? Because we're talking about taxpayers' money, taxpayers' hard-earned money, and every dollar that these governments fail to meet their budget by are dollars that have to be taken out of the pockets of hard-working South Australians, residents, small businesses, taxpayers. It's not a small thing. But no, this government's response to that overspend of $1.3 billion, that deficit of more than $200 million that they have turned this budget into, this government's response was to indeed provide that funding going forward, to bake those overspends into the forward estimates, as has been described by some. There are still some cuts to come as a result of the efficiency dividend applied last year. And so even the surplus next year of another $200 million or so that the government now says is going to be delivered, that is predicated on them actually achieving those efficiency dividends that were put in the budget last year in future years. But why would anyone believe those departments will achieve those efficiencies when they failed to in their first year? And indeed, those failures to deliver on those efficiencies have been forgiven by this Treasurer. I think it's a sign of poor management. I think it's a sign of negligence, fiscal negligence, and I think it's a sign of a government that is unlikely ever to achieve a surplus for the people of South Australia. Because bear in mind, there are two major expenses for which the government has said there is provision in the Treasury. They are identified on page 6 of Budget Statement number 3 as existing, but no sums are identified. We're talking about the preschool reforms, 3-year-old preschool, which I'll come to later, and the skills agreement, both of which are waiting on detail to be provided by, in one case, a Royal Commission, and in another case, a national agreement. And when those agreements come, the government has had a guess at how much that'll cost and put that into the budget. So that's fine. That happens. There's a third major expense coming in terms of the university merger, where the government has said they'll provide substantial funds, haven't said how much, and the Treasurer said today they haven't identified it in the budget. So that's a further cost to come out. But even the skills agreement and the preschool agreement, they are going to have significant and growing costs in the years to come. Commissioner Gillard says that by 2029, we're talking about $200 million a year extra going into our early childhood education budget, and that is not the money that is in the forward estimates. It's a much smaller amount in the next 4 years. So we don't have much faith in the budget papers presenting a true and accurate reflection of what our future budget condition is in South Australia. It's a typical Labor budget where they spend the money, and then when they are turfed out, they expect the Liberal Party to fix the economy. Residents in Morialta would have been very disappointed in this budget were they looking for cost of relief measures, particularly average South Australian mortgage holding families. The average South Australian family with a mortgage is about $20,000 worse off now than it was 12 months ago, than it was at the election. Many such families are the sorts of families who many live in Morialta. Family in Morialta with an average mortgage, 2 kids, due to particularly the increase in mortgages, but also electricity bills, the increase in government fees in many cases, the increased price of shopping, the challenges that are imposed on that family budget see them $20,000 a year worse off. And many of those families went to 2022 with a certain level of hope and optimism. They had a shiny new premier with a penchant for JFK impersonations. They had potentially the power to get out of a pandemic, the hope that the economy would be going forward and record low interest rates. But of course, if they were getting ahead in April or May last year, it's taken just 15 months of a Labor government, but all of a sudden they're $20,000 a year behind. That is a significant concern, but the cost of living concessions and approaches that this government has taken are not geared to those people at all. They've particularly supported some concession increases, and certainly we make no complaints about that. There is some relief for first home buyers who are seeking to build a new property so long as that property is valued at under $650,000, and there may be some Morialta residents, probably not a large number, but there will be some who will benefit from that, and that's welcomed. We're interested in that discussion about whether it should go further. There is, of course, a substantial number of South Australians and a substantial number of Morialta residents who benefit from none of this, who may possibly get the $100 discount on their school fees, a measure proposed by Rob Lucas, for the public school families who are not eligible for school card. And that is about the only cost of living relief that is going to support these families who are otherwise $20,000 worth off. Perhaps they are just $19,900 worse off. So these residents in Morialta are disappointed by this budget. It does very little for them, if anything, and indeed their costs are continuing to feel worse and worse. Their belts are being tightened and tightened. Small businesses and families in Morialta were disappointed. So I described before the Royal Commission into Early Childhood Education and Care. I'll spend the remainder of my time in this speech. I'll talk about the government's response to the Early Childhood Education and Care Royal Commission interim report. I say of this Royal Commission that it was a government election commitment to have a Royal Commission, and in the Honourable Julia Gillard, they have a person with a high level of experience in governance, a level of interest in early childhood education, and an understanding of how the system works. I disagree with many of the things she did as Prime Minister, and I disagree with her fundamentally in relation to her politics, but she is a qualified individual to fulfil this role, and I know she's thrown herself into it with enthusiasm. She's been given a task by this government to deliver an election policy that they were too blasé or disinterested or lazy to write the detail of themselves ahead of the election. And indeed, it's a significant task to describe how you would change the system to introduce three-year-old preschool from 2026. We are very clear, and we've got it in black and white in the government's policy documents that and in their posters, this was expected to see universal three-year-old preschool from 2026. And I think families voting expected that to mean that they would get a preschool-type program for their three-year-old, similar to their four-year-old, available at a public preschool or at a long daycare service with an agreement. And indeed, of course, that is free of charge for those four-year-olds. I think that families voting on this expected that would apply for their family if they had a three-year-old in 2026. It's months and months since the government walked away from that, to the point where they didn't ask the Royal Commissioner to design that. They provided terms of reference, which the Commissioner has delivered in an interim report, which meet those terms of reference. And then the government, having walked away from their commitment to provide universal three-year-old preschool for every child from 2026, having decided the Royal Commissioner has to do all of the hard work, all of the detail work, they've then produced this document, which is on the Royal Commission's website, the South Australian Government response to the interim report. So having declined to do the hard work themselves, we then find over about 5 pages no less than 16 examples of passive-aggressive criticism of the Royal Commission in their work. And I say to the Minister and I say to the government, if you didn't like what the Royal Commission proposed, it might have been more polite to do so in a polite and constructive way, to put forward some suggestions, maybe even to, rather than having a policy of having a Royal Commission to do the work, maybe even just design the program yourselves, rather than giving the Royal Commissioner a task and then having a go at the Commission in so many ways. I found no less than 16 occasions where we see phrases like the Royal Commission is encouraged to undertake further research. The government encourages the Royal Commission to consider whether this method of capacity management may result in unintended consequences. The government would welcome further consideration. The Commission is encouraged to consider. The Commission is encouraged to look further. The government would welcome clarity, particularly pointed if you have heard Department of Education bureaucrats and officials write memos. That is pointed. I like this one. The government is willing to participate in further discussions with the Royal Commission. That was a very generous one in relation to workforce. The government would welcome further testing of this assumption. I think the thesaurus ran out at some point because then there were a stream of the government would welcome the Royal Commission identifying. The Royal Commission may wish to consider, and we're repeating, the Royal Commission may wish to consider. The government encourages the Royal Commission. This sort of language is bureaucratic, but in terms of the 16 points that it raises, it is very clear the government is unhappy with the interim report, and I think they should be more respectful of the Royal Commission. We'll go through the issues. In relation to the interim report stating, and I'm quoting from the government document here, the interim report states there are many families who value government preschool over and above long daycare, as demonstrated through 4-year-olds attending both long daycare and government preschool. How the government is aware that the session times in government preschools often don't meet the needs of working families, and that opportunities to provide before and after care at government preschools need to be further explored. The Royal Commission is encouraged to undertake further research to test its assumptions about likely pattern of demand and usage. Potentially useful, the government could have provided such information in its original submission. The government goes on to talk about what is in fact this issue of progressive universalism. Indeed, in its introduction, the government says the Royal Commission's principle of progressive universal is welcome, and the value of preschool as a means to reduce disadvantage, yet contradictorily they also talk about the findings of the need to provide universal high-quality 3-year-old preschool in South Australia. The question is the government seeking to provide universal service for all South Australians, or are they providing a progressive universal service which is designed particularly to support some South Australians and not other? They can't have it both ways, sir. The government talks about how under current policy every child can have access to a high school preschool program in their local government preschool in the year before full-time school. And they say this policy aims to ensure that preschool is accessible and low cost. The government points out where a three-year-old preschool is delivered through long daycare, a child's local preschool program may be delivered by a long daycare service, with the family meeting the gap between childcare subsidy funding and the cost of the program. The government would welcome further consideration of how the model can meet the aspiration for every child to have access to their local preschool program. And it goes on to also talk about being critical of the Royal Commission. The government talks about preschool enrolments feeding into school enrolments. The point the government is seeking to make is that where the Royal Commission suggests that new need for three-year-old preschool who aren't currently being supported in long daycare will be provided in new government preschools, and this is a cohort of children who are vulnerable, children who aren't accessing three-year-old long daycare now tend to be vulnerable children. The point the government and the department make here is if all of those children go into the new preschool places and those children continue in the four-year-old preschool places, then is that going to create pockets of particular disadvantage rather than having our preschools reflecting the whole of their local communities? If wealthier families with long daycare have all of their children's preschool services provided in long daycare sites, and all of the children who aren't in long daycare now, particularly vulnerable, are provided in government preschools, that, sir, exacerbates disadvantage and inequity. And that is a concern that's being raised here, but it is the necessary corollary of the task that the government set the Royal Commissioner. If this was their concern that it be avoided, then it was something that the government could have turned its mind to before describing this policy. And that is one of the concerns that we've expressed with this policy as well. It's interesting that when we talk about this mixed model where the government's trying to have its cake and eat it too, because as they said earlier, the government sees value in the mixed model approach that is likely to have the broadest reach, it makes its greatest use of existing capacity, and it's likely to be the quickest to roll out. So the government's in favour of the mixed model, but then we've got 16 reasons and concerns with it, and it is very clear that there is a disconnect between what the government is saying and what the government is writing to the Royal Commission. The government says they'd like further clarity on how the proposed model of three-year-old preschool will interact with the existing four-year-old program, and I think that that is particularly related to the point I was just making before about whether those three-year-olds will continue in the same service. Because, of course, part of the benefit, if you're going to have a three-year-old preschool program, is that it is seen as 1 2-year program for the child. If you have some kids doing 12 months in their long daycare centre with the expectation that they'll continue to follow historical trends in the numbers at a local level and do their 4-year-old preschool at the local public preschool, that's not a 2-year preschool model. That is a disjointed setting here, transition, and then a third transition to school before a child's turned 5. That is a risk to that child. The government talks about workforce, and they'd welcome further clarity from the Royal Commission on proposed staffing configurations. That's a difficult challenge ahead. It's not an unreasonable question to ask, and the Royal Commission, the Commissioner particularly attended to this in the media as she did on the day she announced her interim report. We'll be very interested to see how they do it. I think it particularly talks to the unachievable promise the government made when they said that people would have this in 2026. The government says the Royal Commission has found that irrespective of the model chosen for three-year-old preschool, it is likely that impending changes to the childcare subsidy will result in more families choosing long daycare centres for their 4-year-old preschool program, despite it being more costly than government preschool. The government would welcome further testing of this assumption as part of considering family choice, particularly in light of rising cost of living pressures. That is, of course, the nub of the challenge we've been describing. I think that in terms of the breakup of responsibility between state and Commonwealth, the government has welcomed that the Royal Commission has requested that the Commonwealth do some extra heavy lifting. I don't mind that idea as well, but I do make the point that when they talk about, in relation to the national conversation, infrastructure needs, the government says in community-managed early childhood education and services in regional and remote areas, while the Royal Commission has recommended that the state government consider taking on this role, it's arguable this may better align with a role in ensuring the accessibility of services, i.e. the Commonwealth should be doing it. putting the government on notice that this is something we're watching very closely. I expect the Royal Commission probably will recommend that the state government take on this responsibility. It's one that is intense interest to many members on this side of the House, and if the state government tries to shirk that responsibility of the Commonwealth, it'll be just an example of them promising one thing and delivering another. Sir, I commend the bill to the House, but I have significant reservations about how the government proposes to proceed in these areas.
The member for